Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Russell Heath. Russell is the author of Rinn's Crossing. Now, what is Rinn's Crossing? Set against the backdrop of majestic Alaska, Russell has penned a story of Native culture struggling to survive the sleazy world of politics, the lust for power, ego, and money. I'd have to say many of the topics that we are struggling with today and what is our reality. So, Russell, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Hey, thank you, Howard. I'm glad to be here.
Russell, and that last sentence for me was like, wow, we are living this today. Politics, culture struggling to survive, ego, money. And before we kind of get into Rinn's Crossing, which is what this wonderful book of yours is going to touch upon, I would love if you could, for our listeners, talk a little bit about your background and how you came to kind of pen your books of fiction.
Well, my background, pretty eclectic. I'm not sure where to start. One of my favorite places to start is when I had serious dysentery after spending almost a year in Africa. When I was on the streets of Tel Aviv, I was a young kid. I was 24 or 25.
Wait a minute, Africa and Tel Aviv that's not Africa.
So I just left Africa.
Okay.
Jimmy Carter had opened up, had done the
with
in Israel just a few months before. So I was one of the first people to go from Egypt into Israel. And I came into Israel for one reason. I wanted a doctor in a hospital. and for a number of reasons, I couldn't find one. That's another story. But I was wandering the streets of Tel Aviv. And you have to understand that Tel Aviv is the dysenteric's paradise because there's a public John in every other block. And that was about my range. And, I was really struggling. I'd been wandering for a couple of years. And what is it I wanted to do with my life? And I didn't know. I knew what I didn't want to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And what I didn't want was your standard path through life with a house in the burbs and, family and kids. That didn't really interest me. And what I really wanted to do was do whatever I wanted to do. It was, a real adolescent kind of thing. And my thinking there was, and I'm leading here on a specific point for you, Howard, is that I needed a survival skill. And my survival skill became computer programming. So there on the streets of Tel Aviv, I decided to become a computer programmer instead of the waiter, which is usually the fallback for somebody who's chasing a different dream and needs a few bucks. So I became a computer programmer. And that was back in 1979 or 80. So it was a while ago.
When you were coming out of Egypt and Africa and into Tel Aviv, had you, I don't know, not to necessarily date you or to date me, because I certainly can appreciate the 78, 79. I'm thinking to myself, I should have joined the military, but I went into college and wasted years trying to figure out what I was going to be when I grew up. And some ways I still don't know. But how did you all of a sudden decide, okay, I'm going to become a programmer? Because in the day, programming was a little bit different than what we have, in 2020 and in Israel for that matter, Tel Aviv.
So I had some criteria. And the criteria were, I didn't want to have to go back to school for a long time. I needed to make enough so that I could put money to the side so that, say, for every year I worked, I could take a year off. And because I'm a radical introvert, I wanted them to want me more than I wanted them. And I'd had a friend who had taken 2 courses of COBOL at college and dropped out of college and gotten a job that was 2 or 3 times the minimum wage. And since I'd only worked at minimum wage, that sounded like quite a bit of money to me. And back then in the 70s, there wasn't anything as a computer science degree. They would take secretaries and train them how to punch keyboard, IBM key punch.
Punch cards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was good enough for me. So that was my thinking. And, I had a lot of things on that list. I had nurse, right? Because nurse always needed nurses. I had hairdressers because I met a couple of hairdressers that with little educational background, they could always find a job. I had travel agent back when they used to have travel agents, and then a computer programmer. I decided on programmer. It was a really integrated selection.
Well, and you can almost pick up and do that work anywhere because everybody needed COBOL programmers at the time. How did you end up in Africa? Had you, maybe graduated high school and it's like, okay, I'm out of here. I'm doing something else and I want some adventure in my life. How did that little spark, that ember, begin to take shape in your life? Because, for our listeners, I mean, I've got a bunch of show notes here, which I didn't even mention as I was introducing Russell, but I mean, he's lived in, we're going to talk more about in his book, Alaska. We've talked about in Africa, Asia, Alaskan pipeline, sailing, books. You've got an eclectic life. Where did this wanderlust come from?
I don't have a clue. It was just there. And I grew up in a suburb. From the earliest days, I hated suburbs. To me, they're vapid and they're kind of existential void there. And I would live in the bowels of a big city or in the wilderness before I'd live in a suburb. So I was growing up in a suburb, and very quickly, I was probably 13 or 14, I discovered Alaska, and that's where I wanted to go. I left high school after 11th grade. I had a couple of missteps, but eventually, and a couple of years later, I got to Alaska. I hitchhiked up there in 1974. So I was living there, and then I wanted to live in an exciting and a different country. So Italy was the country to live in. And I still had some money left over from the pipeline, about 10 grand. So I decided what to do with that. And said, well, Africa looks interesting. I'm going really quickly here. And eventually I found a guy who had a truck, and we drove across the Sahara Desert and in through the jungles of Central Africa, into the Sudan, down to Egypt. He sold the truck in Kenya. And then I wandered around the savannas there for several months, and then back up through Sudan. I was way out in the Darfur region. It was just really isolated parts of this planet. It was so peaceful back then, no wars. And then back up through Egypt, into Tel Aviv, where I needed some serious intestinal work done.
Right. I'm curious, how did these experiences shape you? Because, look, you and I right now, let's just say we're 50 plus.
Speak for yourself.
We're going to give ourselves a break there. Okay. I don't care how old you are. I'm not going to share how old I am, but let's just say we're 50 plus. We're 50 plus year old balding white guys. And we're going into a lot of different parts of this world. What was it like being literally a fish out of water in these really remote parts of the world?
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree with your fish out of water, because almost everywhere you go, people are just tremendously friendly. They'll take you into your homes.
Okay.
And they're really welcoming. Truly welcoming. I mean, Sudan, when I was there, was one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, and their hospitality was beyond compare. I mean, I learned a lot about what hospitality means. And of course, on the other hand, I was the most exciting thing that had happened to them all year. I show up in some little village and it's, oh my God, look what you come to town. And of course, this is all pre-internet, and most of these remote places didn't have any electricity whatsoever. So yeah, maybe I was a fish out of water, but I didn't see that. I was just participating in people's lives and learning a lot about how different people view the world and how they make their way through it.
Well, it's interesting. And, again, apologies when I say fish out of water, I'm saying it in the nicest way. I'm thinking, here you are, an immensely curious individual. Who are the people and living in this culture that I'm now visiting? What can I learn from it? What can I take away from it? And it's just a wonderful opportunity to become a sponge and be, culturally intelligent, to realize not everybody is just like me. I'm kind of envious in a way too. Is a phenomenal experience, because given today, there's so many parts of the world we can't go to because of the violence that is there. And as you made your way back to the States and, living in Alaska and having this environmental spin to some of the work that you're doing, how did that experience start to take shape in terms of, the books like Rinn's Crossing? And for our listeners, his first novel was Broken Angels, an Alaska Mystery. It was published in 2015. So Alaska has been a part of your authoring as far as fiction work is concerned. How did this love of Alaska start to take shape? As you mentioned earlier, the pipeline, but when did these books start to evolve for you?
Well, two questions there, Howard. When did my love for Alaska take shape, and then when did I write the books out of that? So Alaska, as I said, it was 13 or 14 when I discovered it, and it was instantly, you don't make decisions there. Decisions are made for you. And I had maps of Alaska on my wall and read books about Alaska and living in the middle of the woods, living off the land. And if there was a why there, the why for me would be that I was immensely uncomfortable around people, didn't enjoy them at all. And so where my psyche was going, as a young teenager, was away. I wanted to be independent and by myself back in the wilderness. And this is a really common motif in Alaska. Many people, particularly men, particularly teenage boys, find themselves in Alaska or go to Alaska so they don't have to deal with people. And the flip side, of course, is it's an opportunity for tremendous adventures. It's unbelievably beautiful. And Alaska, in a way, really both scours and embraces your soul in a way that a suburb never will. So, Alaska in many ways was both my psychological, spiritual icon or Mecca that I went to.
And I would imagine, and from the 70s, 80s, and into today, I was in Alaska once, probably mid-2000s, and it was just majestic. And it's like, wow. I remember taking the Alaska Railroad from Anchorage through Denali up to Fairbanks, and it's just amazing beauty. And there's so many threats to this majesty these days. We've got the environmental threats. We've got the opening up our nation's reserves to more mining. And where did this idea of this environmental activism come up for you? How did that get sparked for you?
Well, I'd say the same thing that as Alaska. So that, when I was growing up, it was the Vietnam War, and any activism I had there was directed towards the Vietnam War or against the Vietnam War at the time. But as I got later in my teenage years, and again, this wasn't conscious. This is, me looking back at things. As I got, towards my teenage years, and the world of nature looked much safer and much more embracing than the world of people to me. So my activism shifted. Of course, when the war was over, I didn't have to worry about the draft. But my activism shifted towards nature or towards the environment. And so both Alaska and my environmental concern, were intertwined there.
And with the environmental concern, had you started to maybe take notes in a notebook, or what was kind of like the spark, this ember for the books, Alaska as the backdrop? When did that start to take shape?
Okay, so I just want to make clear to your listeners that there's a gap of 20 or 30 years between going to Alaska and starting to think of Rinn's Crossing. And in those 30 years, I had run two different environmental organizations in Alaska. One, the Alaska Environmental Lobby, where I represented the Alaska environmental community in the state legislature. And then a large organization called the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, or SEAC, which oversaw or protected the Tongass National Forest, which is the rainforest in Alaska. It's the part of Alaska up against British Columbia. It's a lot of water, and it's a tremendously fertile and unbelievably beautiful spot. So I had those two experiences there. But what triggered Rinn's Crossing, and it was really triggered a while ago, is that the industrial logging on the forest was just horrific. And it was, to me, it was just painful in an emotional sense to see these glorious trees that were 500 or 600 years old being cut. And their use was a commodity. They were turned into pulp, or they were turned into rayon. The use of some of those trees, some of those trees have gone into, Steinway pianos and Gibson guitars. And there, one tree is worth $20,000. But when it goes into rayon, it's worth about $5. So I started fantasizing, started thinking, well, what would it be like to kind of sneak into one of these logging camps and just take out all their machinery? No one would catch me. And I knew it wouldn't do any good because, the industrial onslaught is relentless. They just bring in new machines and start all over again. But it would be really cathartic. And then I thought, well, what would I do if somebody else were charged with my crime? And then I got to thinking, what would I do? And that was the spark of the novel. So in the very first chapter, Rinn sneaks into a logging camp, takes out their machinery. And then his former lover, Kit, is charged with a crime. And then a murder that coincidentally happened on the same evening. So Rinn's mission now is to see how he can save Kit without getting himself in jail himself. So that was the spark of it.
And as the book progresses, you had brought in some elements of Native culture, the politics, as I said in the intro, power, ego, money. How did that start to take shape in the books? I mean, what are the lessons learned, or are there lessons learned for the reader coming from this book? Can there be something they can take away and say, this is not right? What can I do to stop this, as you were saying, this environmental onslaught? Because it seems insurmountable. Every time we turn around, some damage is being done, or the case is being made for removing regulations that, in turn, our environment will soon be impacted. So what are some of those lessons for the reader that you'd like to give them?
First of all, like you and I are both coaches, and my interest is a lot less the ideology and the social message. And my interest is far more how people relate to what they believe. What is it? We all have different points of view. We all have different values. I mean, they're similar to a certain extent. But even with the United States, as you said, we can see today how different they are, and how different people see the same event through very, very different lenses. So my interest was less in a environmental social justice message. And for your listeners, the book is not ideological. I'm not up there ranting. Instead, what I have is I've got 4 different characters, 3 who are friends at the beginning of the novel, and 1 who's not, who all have a different view, a different ideal of what Alaska should be. And each of them believe it fervently to the very fibers of their being. So we have Rinn, who used to be, the independent woods guy who's actually given up. He's like a nihilist now and lives back in the woods. His former lover, Kit, who's still committed. She's the environmentalist. We have Dan, who is a Alaska native. And of course, Alaska natives have millennia of connection to Alaska, and they're trying to survive in a new world that really wasn't made for them. And then finally, there's the developer. And the developer's not an evil guy any more than the others, in the sense, though, that he sees Alaska's resources as God's gift to Alaskans, to Americans, that, they provide jobs and they provide ways where people can better themselves. So all 4 of these people have very legitimate points of view. The problem becomes when you put them all in the same room, or they're all arguing over the same state. That's when the conflict arises. And it's in that conflict that I really had the novel play out.
And with this conflict, is there, again, as you're a coach, I'm a coach, in conflict, there's collaboration, there can be consensus, there can be, I'm right, you're wrong. We can walk away from the conflict. How does this conflict play itself out? I mean, again, we want your readers to read the book, but, how do you see, as a coach, this conflict playing out?
So good question. And yes, I'm not going to give anything away. The arena in which it plays out is in the Alaska State Legislature. So as I mentioned, I had been a lobbyist, an environmental lobbyist. And so I know how the legislature works. And because legislators tend to be fairly full of themselves, when they let their hair down, they would tell a lot of stories, which I would just kind of sucked up and stored away. I didn't know I was doing research for my book at that point, but nevertheless. And I then took a lot of those stories, a lot of their manipulations of procedure, their dirty tricks, all the underhanded things that in some respects is what makes politics happen. Took all those and put them in this story. So back to your question, Howard, the conflict happens within the legislature and behind the legislature, because politics can't happen just on the Senate or the House floor. You have to be building coalitions, you have to be bringing people along with you, and you have to be splitting your opponents apart. And to be clear that in my book, there's not a good side and a bad side. I mean, they're all fighting for what they see as right. They think they're right, and there are consequences to that.
With a book like this, and I'm curious today, just given the nature of, we've got the wildfires out west and just the new storm coming up into the Gulf. I mean, just this globe of ours is just taking a major hit continuously. What kind of hope do you have for, a wonderful, state like Alaska, which so much resource, when I think of shooting, I want to go there and shoot my camera. I want to shoot the Northern Lights, and I want to shoot, the mountains, and some people go shoot with guns. And then you've got the folks that are claiming the resources. What kind of hope do you have for, given what you know about politics in Alaska, being a part of that environmental lobbies and working with the legislator, what kind of hope do you have for a state like Alaska that is really just, it's a jewel, and what we're doing to it now?
Well, you're right. It is a jewel. Alaska is a jewel, and there are many, many other jewels around the planet. Well, the planet itself is a jewel. Well, you're asking a difficult question, and I would probably give you a pretty complex answer. The first thing that I would hope all of us recognize is that we are all complicit. So I may not be a hunter, and I certainly have many friends who are hunters, but when the farmer who grew my broccoli cleared his field, he destroyed habitat. He killed animals. So I'm just as complicit, even as a vegetarian, in the destruction of the planet, right? And being an American, even though I may eat low on the food chain and am pretty careful about what I buy and what I spend, I'm still tremendously resource consumptive, certainly compared to most human beings through most of history. So I don't see, again, I think there's a danger in looking at us as good and, on the good side or the bad side. Again, we're all complicit, but you're asking for hope. And this is where I circle back to politics. See, I believe that politicians get a bad rap because politics is really, it's the art, it's the skill, it's the game of managing conflicting interests and conflicting points of view and conflicting ideas of what the truth is. And it's only through politics that we'll ever find a solution to our problems. And in fact, when you think about it, the only human community that doesn't have politics is a graveyard. So again, I think our hope lies in politics. And part of politics working well is when we have a system, a structure in place that manages, as you mentioned at the beginning of the set, our egos and our lust for money or sex or whatever. That's a given. Our founding fathers understood that was part of being human. We're not going to rip that out of ourselves. The key is how do you create a system that mitigates that, manages that, so you can get something done. And, if I were looking at the United States today, I would say that to a certain extent, our system, not the people, but the system itself is no longer working, and it needs to be rejuiced, rethought. And I know there are a lot of people that have had some really interesting ideas about how we can reform our system so that we can do the politics we need to do to solve our problems.
Very good. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm curious now with this new book, and you've had a remarkable career. I guess life is probably a better shape because you've had many careers, you've done many things. And as you look back, do you have regrets, things you wish you had done differently, or do you look at, hey, this is what I've done. I'm going to continue to look forward and take on new challenges as they come my way?
Yeah, not a lot of regrets. I mean, if we were talking hypotheticals, if I were to do things differently, there are a couple key things that I would do differently. And again, as a coach, you might appreciate this. So I discovered coaching in my mid-40s, and it changed my life. And I know the coaching industry is brand new, even now. But old Werner Erhard was working his ass back in the 70s. And if I'd gotten started with him back in the 70s when I was in my 20s, that would have brought an extra couple more decades with a lot more life and fun into it than having to start in my 40s.
Well, I have to share with you, I too started in the coaching in my 40s. So we definitely have similarities there, and it's been absolutely wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the coaching. Who are your clients and how are they coming to seek you out?
Yeah, good question. So just my type of coaching, it's typically, or it's ontological coaching. So it means we study your way of being. What I work for as a coach with my clients is one, to expand their range. So if somebody comes to me And they have like 10 tools in their toolkit. And by tools, I usually mean behaviors, 10 ways in which they engage the world. I want to double that to 20. And all of a sudden, you've got a lot more tools or a lot more things you can do with life. Life becomes a lot easier and a lot more fun. And then related to that, the more ontological part of it is we tend to be reactive. A situation happens, we react to it. Something happens out in the world and we have a reaction to it. And when I'm working with clients, we want to put the reaction to the side, have the client draw a breath, take a pause, get present, say, okay, this thing just happened out in the world. What are the results I want from this? Where do I want my life to go as a result of this circumstance? And then have them create their life. So they choose how they want to be in the face of whatever the circumstances. And so those two things, expanding a person's range and moving them from reactivity, creativity, is a central focus of my coaching. And the people I tend to work with, they tend to be pretty high-performing professionals, usually mid-career, average age 40. Well, I've worked with 20-year-olds and I work with 60-year-olds, but average age is 40. They've been very successful in their career and they have good marriages and families. And by and large, things are going well. Yet there's something missing there for them. There's something that feels like there's an emptiness or a hole. And what I do is I work with them to see what it is and see what it might be to fill it. And actually, I don't like that metaphor, filling a hole, because again, I'm more, that implies that there's something wrong with them. It's more of how they can grow so they can engage life more fully and more comprehensively than they could in the past.
Coaching is just such a wonderful profession that we get to help others kind of discover choices or their full potential and to realize they have many more tools at their disposal than they perhaps thought they had at the onset. With your writing, your first novel, Broken Angels, now Rinn's Crossing, do you see yourself continuing down this path of writing, works of fiction? What are your thoughts on, kind of the years ahead for you?
Yeah, so I've got 3 projects on tap right now. One is, back in my 30s, I sailed around the world. I had a little wooden sailboat, and I left Juneau, Alaska in 1985 and spent 4 years sailing. And I'm ready to write a book about that now. And I'd really like it to be both an adventure story, and boy, there are a lot of adventures in that trip, but there's also a lot of learning, a lot of, how do I engage the universe here? And so it'll be something of an adventure story wrapped with a contemplative essay. And I hope to get started on that in the next couple of months. 2 is I'm building a boat. This one's a wherry, which is a rowing boat, about 17-foot lapstrake construction. And it'll take me about 2 years to build her. I've never built a boat before, so I have to be really careful and meticulous. So it rows straight. And I want to row her around Newfoundland. So my goal is 2023 is to row her around Newfoundland. And then my 3rd project is I've never gotten my coaching certification. I've been coaching professionally now for almost 10 years, and I've never got my PCC, or I'm almost qualified for my master's coaching certificate. So I need to knock that out.
Fantastic. I can appreciate for me, it's the PCC. I've had the hours, but I've just never gotten around to finishing it up. But I love the ideas around the sailing and the rowing. I mean, I know on one of your pages, I did see some pictures of you and one of your boats. And when you were sailing around the world, was this completely solo, or did you have a crew at any given time?
No, I did have friends on a couple of passages. So when I left Juneau, I had a friend, Bob Frampton, and he and I sailed from Juneau to Seattle, and he went back up to Alaska. Neither of us knew how to sail. I mean, I didn't know how to take in a reef. I didn't know how to anchor. I didn't know how to navigate. I assumed I learned how to navigate on the way down to Seattle. And I didn't want to use a GPS. I only wanted to use Sextant. There are 2 complexities of learning how to navigate on the high seas. One is I didn't realize I got seasick, and I couldn't. There's no way I could read a textbook on celestial navigation without vomiting. And 2 is there's no way to check your sights. you take a shot of the sun and you've got this little point on the North Pacific, but you could be all the way over to Japan for all you know. There's no way to confirm it because one chunk of the ocean looks like every other chunk. So that was a bit of a miscalculation on my part.
That's a heck of a miscalculation. I've sailed minimally out on the ocean, mostly out in Lake Michigan, and it's a wonderful experience. But I have also this desire to be back at shore with an adult beverage. So,
well, there's no limitation on adult beverages when you're at sea.
I love this idea of the building this canoe type and rowing around Newfoundland, and I think that just have a nice little stand for your GoPro, and there's a great vlog that you could be producing along the way as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do that. So when I was sailing, I did take a camera, but it's interesting. I took one roll of film between Ecuador and New Zealand, and by the time I had it developed in New Zealand, the first pictures had all rotted. It was like 18 months between the two. So I'm not much of a photographer. I hope to do a better job when I'm rowing around Newfoundland.
Well, as far as the technology is concerned, that's the wonderful thing about it. It just continually evolves. And when I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, my goal was to do car camping so that I could go out and do one-day trips. And I have an interest in dark sky photography. So for you, it's just Google is your friend. I mean, all the YouTube videos and the people who have answered the question that you might have. And so I have no doubt, in 2023, when you're making that trek around Newfoundland, that you'll have part of that answer covered as well.
May I interrupt just a second there, Howard?
Yeah.
So you said dark night photography. Let me tell you a story. And you asked her earlier if I had any regrets. So this is one of two regrets on the sailing trip. So it's February of 1987, I think. I stuck my head out. I was sailing back towards Tahiti. And again, since I sail by myself, I was pretty good at waking up in the middle of the night every couple hours to check my course and check the sails, making sure everything's okay. So I stuck my head out the hatch, and I didn't put on my glasses. I'm super myopic. And I looked around, and the course was okay, and the sails were okay. And then I looked up at the sky. And there in the area where the Lesser Magellanic Cloud was this big star. And at this point, I knew the night sky really well because I navigated by the stars. I knew all the constellations, all the navigational stars. And I said, there's no star there. But you don't argue with the universe. If there's a star there, there's a star there. So I just assumed I was wrong, and I went home. I went back down below and went back to sleep. So 3 or 4 days later, I sail into Tahiti. And after I'm cleared in, I'm walking down the main street, and there on all the newsstands is the international copy of Time magazine. And on the cover of the magazine is the first supernova that could be seen in the naked eye in 400 years. And I didn't even put on my bloody glasses.
Oh, wow. There's a little bit of a regret. But
yeah.
But, I mean, just to be out there in the middle of the ocean with just the stars kind of coming down on you. And there's just a wonderful feeling of seeing that. And that's, again, another reason for me to be out west is just the access to nature and the parks. But I would love if you could, Russell, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
So I have 2 websites. I have one, my coaching website, and then also my book website. So my coaching website is russellheath.net, N-E-T. And if you just Google Russell Heath Coach, I pop right up. And then my writing website is russellheathauthor.com. And again, if you Google Rinn's Crossing, Russell Heath, I pop right up. But you can find out a lot in those 2 websites. And if any of your listeners are really interested in the sailing trip, I gave a talk to the Explorers Club several years ago. And that was videoed, and it's available on YouTube. So if you want a good talk about sailing around the world, go to YouTube, Russell Heath, circumnavigation, and I should pop up there too.
Fantastic. You know what we'll do, Russell? We'll get the backlink, to the YouTube video onto our show notes, as well as to the Russell Heath author site and to your coaching website, russellheath.net. And Russell, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really kind of feel like, God, I wish we had some adult beverages. We could just keep going, because the stories, I would imagine, are just absolutely amazing. But that's the beauty of our lives. We get, every day we wake up, we get to make a new story.
No, there we go.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Success Insight podcast.
Well, thank you. And I certainly appreciate your questions, Howard, and best of luck to you.
Fantastic. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Russell Heath. He's the author of Rinn's Crossing, set against the backdrop of majestic Alaska. Russell has penned the story of Native cultures struggling to survive, the world of politics, the good, the bad, the ugly, and of course, the lust for power, ego, and money. And, chatted a lot about Russell's background, what he's doing today, and his aspirations for the next coming years and his projects he's working on. So really just a fascinating conversation. Russell's a fascinating man, and definitely love for you to go out and learn more about him and his work. And of course, again, we'll provide backlinks to his website, russellheath.net, as well as russellheathauthor.com, his book website. And we'll also get the link to the YouTube video so you can learn more about his sailing trip. There you have it, folks. I hope you have enjoyed today's podcast. If you did and would like to comment on it, we would love to hear from you. So please go out and visit us on successinsightpodcast.com. Leave a comment. And you can also find us on the major podcast channels, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook at Success Insight Podcast as well. And you can find us on YouTube at Success Insight Podcast. Okay? So, hey, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, be safe, take care of yourself and your families. And, hey, we are still in the midst of our little COVID-19 pandemic, so practice social distancing, wear a mask, I hope, and again, just take care of yourselves. And we will see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.